if you look at what's going on, we have the tech people building the clouds and the telecommunications. We have the military doing space and Operation Warp Speed. So they're putting up the satellites, okay? Then we have Big Pharma, which is making the injections that are full of these mystery ingredients and modify your DNA, and for all we know, make you infertile. And then we have the media pouring out the propaganda. And then we have the central bankers engineering the central bank crypto systems. So you have these different pillars, and it's very important when you look at what's going on day to day, particularly in the media. They're trying to keep them separate so that you can't see how they're going to come together in an integrated system, which is basically integrated into your body and your mind.
For what purpose?
To institute the slavery system. So in other words, if I am going to do everything through a smart grid, and I need to run the smart grid into your neighborhood, and then I need to run the smart grid into your body, the question is, how am I going to build it out in your neighborhood and build it out in your body without you seeing the trap, right? So that's why you try and keep these different lines separate. So if you listen to the central bankers, they try as hard as they can to stay away from these conversations. So it was interesting. I was watching an IMF presentation on cross-border payments, and the Federal Reserve Chairman, the head of the IMF, mentioned the digital global ID system. And you would have the Federal Reserve Chairman almost blanched, and you could energetically feel him moving like a galaxy away. It's like, no, because, there are 325 million Americans, and there are more than 325 million guns. And he doesn't want everybody to see this until the trap is thrown. It's too late.
Welcome to the second panel of the Independent Media Alliance. Now today, the IMA brings you a panel on the rise of the digital ID and how it is a foundational part of the growing technocratic agenda. We will discuss the interesting way that digital IDs continue to be the solution to whatever problem is currently facing the people, and how these problems can usually be traced back to the very government proposing the so-called solution. We will highlight the differing dialectics used to promote digital ID by the different sides of the government to give the illusion of opposition, yet show how all lead to the same outcome, and how all of this leads to the technocratic control structure that will enslave Democrats and Republicans alike. Joining today is Iain Davis and Whitney Webb, and probably some more that might come in after the fact. Now we're going to be discussing the digital ID and how it is rolling out around the world. Now there's no denying this obvious agenda and its potential influence over and restriction of your freedom and self-determination. So we're going to start today with the general point for those that might not know, interested how that's even possible is beyond me, but not know you're aware of the growing digital ID looming problem, and just kind of discuss what that is for those that might not know. So Whitney, Iain, how are you today?
Very well, Ryan. Thanks very
doing
much
great.
for inviting me.
Thanks, Ryan.
So let's start with that. I think as much as it may seem like a kind of too broad of a question, it seems there's a lot of people out there that still may not really grasp what at least we think this is. So Whitney, if you want to start, just kind of, get into the idea of what digital ID is and start us off.
Sure. Well, digital ID is a lot of things. I guess for our purposes and maybe for the interests of our collective audiences, what it really is a linchpin for the so-called Sustainable Development Agenda, as a lot of the SDGs and the different things it hopes to achieve, roughly half of them, according to the UN itself, rely on some sort of digital ID system being in place. So there's a couple differences about what digital ID will actually be in practice and how it will be marketed. And Iain and I have collaborated on the past on digital ID, and one of the things we pointed out there is that the way it will face the public, they'll try and market it as a decentralized, lots of different systems that are separate from each other, But really, in practice, all of the data from all of those is going to be collated and sent to a centralized database. So regardless of how many digital ID systems end up blooming, quote unquote, around the world, ultimately, even though they may appear to all be different, or different companies or governments, whatever may be behind them, all of that data, the plan is to have it all sent to a centralized database, and to have all of these different digital ID platforms be interoperable. So obviously, the end goal of that, I would argue, is to convince the public that it's not a single global government system of digital ID, even though in practice it is.
Yeah. Ian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo very much what Whitney's just said. I mean, I think it's something like, if you take the specific targets of the sustainable development of each goal, you add them together, there's about 92 separate specific kind of broad targets. And I think the UN says that 47 of those are dependent upon SDG 16.9, which is to roll out digital identity to everyone on the planet. That's the goal. And what they've done very much, I mean, one of the first things that they did after setting up the SDGs in 2016, after they went from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the first things they did, in fact, I think it might have been the first thing that they did, was set up the ID 2020 kind of overarching framework. And I think it's important to stress what that is. It's for a start, it's a public-private partnership, and it's very much the private parties like Accenture and Gavi and IDEO and these kind of companies that first set up ID 2020 that are driving it. And the idea is to create what they call technological standards for various what they call vendor agnostic digital ID products. So they set up these kind of and there's a framework that they're building out with these kind of modular design platforms that enable the various vendors around the world to construct vendor agnostic digital ID products. But the point is, as long as the kind of technical specifications are centrally controlled, and there are a set of approved, like for example, the World Bank has got its ID 4D set of technological standards that are required for its interoperability with its database. So there's a whole smorgasbord of these different technological standards, but providing that the vendor, whatever the private developer is that is developing the digital ID product, providing that they subscribe or to those standards, and that what World Bank says is that they want machine readable data, biometric data that is compatible with with these sets of protocols and standards. And providing that the product does, then it doesn't really matter what it is. It could be a driving license, it could be a bank card, it could be anything really, anything that you require ID, as long as it meets that, those specifications, it will be interoperable, which means that the data can be harvested from that product. So, I mean, even things like, think like a store card or something like that, which, might have a picture of your face on it. That's your biometric data. Even things like that. You see, so from I guess from the public's perspective, from the user's perspective, you won't necessarily know that it's that the data that you're handing over, perhaps unwittingly, is being harvested in order to be entered into a centralized and centrally controlled system, which is more like a network of global ID. But you won't necessarily know that from for you, it'll just be a store card. So I think it's important to understand that I think it's unlikely that many Western governments will be rolling out anything that it could even be perceived as a government issued digital ID. It'll be a government issued driving license or a government issue. It won't be sold to the public, I don't think, as digital ID, but that's what it will be. And we're certainly seeing that in the UK, obviously, with travel. The government has already agreed that we need to hand over facial recognition, fingerprints for travel to the EU Schengen area, which for the British is a very popular destination, Europe, mainland Europe. So, it's through these kind of backdoor processes that we are being lulled into this system of global ID without really even knowing that that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
to that I would. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Whitney. Go ahead.
Well, I think to that I would add that in terms of how it's going to be rolled out, I definitely agree with Ian. And if you're looking at what's going on in the U.S., they're absolutely starting with driver's licenses at the state
Mhm.
level, and it's irrespective of party. So you have Ron DeSantis of the Republican Party in Florida, who has drastically advanced the Florida digital ID. I think they're called smart cards or something like that, or smart driver's license or something like that. That's produced by some World Economic Forum strategic partner or something funny. And then Gavin Newsom of the Democratic Party in California is rolling them out, and there's several other states rolling it out as well. And then, places around the world, there's really been a huge uptick in it over the past few years. For example, where I live in Chile, they announced that in December, just before Christmas, you'll finally be able to get your very own digital ID at the, civil registry or whatever. So I think what's important to point out there is that as it's being rolled out, much like we saw with the vaccine passports, arguably a trial run for digital ID, the goal is to sell it as something that's voluntary, at least at first, but voluntary in the same sense of vaccine passports being voluntary. And that if
Right.
you choose not to have a digital ID, you will become excluded from society to the point where you will have no legal rights. And as far as the state is concerned, you won't exist and you won't be able to participate in the economy. But I think it's quite likely that it won't be like that straight away. It'll be, a gradual process of exclusion
Right.
and a gradual process of it's voluntary. I'm sure, for example, when Chile rolls it out, it probably will be voluntary the first month or something as they slowly try and get more and more people to adopt them. Right. But once they reach that
Mm.
certain threshold, they don't really need to
Right.
play around with it anymore. But I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of this is going to be marketed with a lot of buzzwords like it's voluntary, it's decentralized, really anything to try and assuage any people's, concerns and fears. But it's ultimately, illusory.
Yeah. Well, and we saw the same thing as you pointed out during COVID-19. It's the same dynamic in any illusion of choice, where at first it's like, well, you do this and you get to go to the front of the line. And then of course it gravitates to, well, if you don't do it, you go to the back of the line. And then it becomes you're not welcome in the line if you don't get this thing. And it always goes that way, And so it's the evolving narrative. And as Iain pointed out, an article we put up a while back, the ID 2020 defector, if you remember this, who spoke out. She actually broke off from the group and spoke out, calling it techno-solutionism, how they were applying that to the COVID-19 dynamic, because the ID 2020 was well before that. And it's the point, as I said in the beginning, it evolves to whatever the next thing is that needs to be the solution, because this is really what they want to achieve. And the whole biometric thing I want to point out is something that really does, I think we're at a point where obviously that's concerning, but I think we're also, most people don't really, I don't think we fully grasp what that will mean 20, 50 years from now. The biometric data, as even with Whitney talking about being depersoned on social media, there's a weird overlap to where this goes that I see, it just concerns me. And I think what I would just discuss what it is, going back to what Catherine said in that clip in the opening, it's the step one into the larger control structure that really is, under the guise of something that helps you, or it's going to be a choice, as we're all saying, but ultimately it becomes a forced idea. So let's talk about how it's marketed, right? And this is something that we've been talking about a lot in all of our different channels as we discuss the different dialectics of the two parties. And really, it's always how that, in my opinion, that the two-party illusion always works to sort of give you different perspectives that distill you down to the one thing the government ultimately wants from you. And so let's talk about that in regard to the left versus the right and the false, the illusion therein. So whoever wants to start on that, the differences between the narratives that both justify digital IDs.
Mm-hmm.
Would
you like to start, Iain, since I just talked? Yeah.
I don't mind. You can carry on if you want.
Sure, it's fine with me. So I think it's pretty clear that the left and the right are both marketing digital ID as a solution to problems that their different bases want solutions for. But obviously the solution is as digital ID is the same and is actually unlikely to solve the problems they're claiming they will solve. And arguably some of the, really most of the crises that they're claiming to solve have been manufactured crises, potentially on purpose, with the express purpose of manufacturing consent for digital ID. So in Western countries where there tends to be a lot more of a concern about the implementation of these types of, identification documents or digital documents. It's been, I think, quite clear, at least in comparing the UK and the US, that conservatives, whether it's Trump or Rishi Sunak, seem to be selling digital ID as a solution to the illegal immigration problem, which every government in the past 20 years in the US has allowed to happen. Even Trump, who ran on a very anti-illegal immigration platform, abandoned building a physical barrier in favor of the previously and still Democrat favored quote unquote smart wall, which would necessarily require some sort of facial recognition or digital ID functionality. And on the campaign trail more recently has been promoting the idea of the necessity of a biometric entry-exit tracking system, his words, that's a direct quote, in order to solve the illegal immigration crisis. And it's also been pitched by people within the Trump campaign orbit as a solution to voter fraud. Right. Which is again a long-standing issue, important to the Republican base specifically, and being marketed by them as digital ID will become necessary as a means to vote. But what about the existing physical IDs that exist in the U.S. and why can't voter ID be instituted that way? Apparently, a digital only solution, is the only way because it's the future, right, guys? And then on the left, it seems like, again, comparing the US and the UK, there seems to be a lot of overlap about the need for digital ID to protect children online, to stop online hate, and to police online speech. And then they also, I think, use another marketing scheme, I guess, that I think is also meant to appeal mainly to the left, that talks about digital ID as a human right, as a way to promote inclusion of the most disenfranchised people in the world, when in reality, the digital ID technocratic scheme has been tested on the most impoverished and vulnerable people in the world, and has sort of onboarded them onto this technocratic system, forcing them to choose between joining the technocratic system and surrendering all of their data, or not being able to eat. For example, right. If you look at the Building Blocks World Food Program, or some of these efforts that have been done at the behest of ID 2020 on stateless people between Myanmar and Thailand, for example. And there's a lot of other examples of their efforts being sort of beta tested on them, with the intent of course, now rolling it out globally. And, I think there's a lot we could probably unpack there, Iain, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important when we listen to the language that's coming out of places like the United Nations and their partners, is that, when they say things like, it's an inversion more often than not. So when they say things like financial inclusion, what they mean is financial exclusion. That's mm-hmm. So when they first started talking about setting up the need for financial inclusion, they talk about something called the identity gap. So the identity gap is the idea. The identity gap is the idea that unless you can prove who you are, you don't exist. But the identity gap, of course, didn't exist itself until they created it by calling it the identity gap. So when we've already seen in places like India, where they've probably further down the road than a lot of countries in terms of rolling out a kind of a meaningful system of digital ID with their Aadhaar program. And linking that to important services such as food aid, the system that if the idea through digital ID is that that's going to create some sort of better environment for people to be able to access essential services, what we've seen certainly in India is the opposite. Because once people have got access to the systems, then they abuse the system. So we've seen situations, for example, in India, where people have been using digital ID to double register things like grain quotas. So the recipient of the food aid you know, it's signed off using their digital ID number, and it's, you know, because obviously the point of the biometric data is to link it to a real physical person. So they use their digital ID to register for something like a grain quota. The supplier gives them half the grain quota, tells them to sling their hook, and sells the rest on the black market. So the idea that digital ID will be more inclusive and that it will enable people to live better lives is something that is already proving to be false. I mean,
Or
you
that
can
it
look at
will
other,
prevent fraud, right? And with
Right.
the
or
example
that
you
it
just
will.
gave. Mhm.
I mean, also another thing that when they're talking, if you think about it, if you're creating this centralized network of digital ID, and linking that to things like people's financial activity, linking it to you know, their purchasing habits, linking it to their health records, their health care, what you're creating is the mother of all data sets for scammers and, you know, well, not necessarily scammers, just unscrupulous corporations that be very interested in that kind of data. So the idea that it's going to be some sort of safer environment and better for everybody is quite preposterous, really, because it's effectively going to be something like a digital Wild West. You know,
Right.
you know, they're rolling out these systems and rolling out, and we're already seeing that they're being abused and they're being exploited.
They always
But
are.
so yeah, and so with
Yeah.
things like financial inclusion, the idea is that, you know, obviously people that are the so-called unbanked will be able to access the money that they need in order to, you know, purchase food, for example. We've already seen with things like, you know, I mean, a lot of people in our media space, in the alternative media, have already seen that themselves kicked off payment platforms for saying the wrong thing. The IMF were talking, oh God, years ago. I mean, I'm talking, you know, 5, 6 years ago about linking people's biometric digital ID to log onto the internet, linking it with their
Right.
browser history to their financial uh, access to finances. So if they're creating a system, and the point I would suggest of something like a global network of digital ID is control. That's the
Mhm.
point of it. It's behavioral control. So you know, I mean,
Mhm.
social credit element of that is obviously, you know, digital ID enables that to happen, you know, more efficiently than without it.
Yeah. And I think right
One thing
now
I want
what's
to
so
add to
clear.
that. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, one thing I want to add to that really quick. So when ID 2020 was created, I think it was in 2012 or something to that effect, around there. There was like an inaugural event organized under the auspices of the UN, and one of the earliest people involved in ID 2020, I forget her name, sorry, but it's in past reports I've done. She gave a report at that inaugural event describing digital ID as the advent of freedom as a service, which I found a very
That's
interesting
crazy.
term. Essentially, the idea that digital ID, if you agree to have it, your lease, instead of having like inalienable freedoms and rights like granted by God or just by nature of you existing, instead, no, you're going to be leasing your freedom from the people that issue
Wow.
and control your digital ID. So, you know, in a nutshell, that's really the idea of what it is. And like really, you know, is a way of using like industry gobbledygook words to show that it is in fact an inherently exclusionary system, and is meant to deny or grant you access to certain freedoms, you know, based on the data harvested and connected to your digital ID, which is
That's
ultimately what it's all about.
That's pretty wild. I mean, it's the same thing they do around the Constitution these days from a U.S.
Yeah.
perspective, where it's like, oh, we give you these rights, and they just blatantly ignore that that's not true. That's wild, though, like the reframing of it. But, you know, I think these things, as I think we probably all agree, are interconnected, obviously, whether CBDCs, the social credit aspect. And I agree completely with both
They
of you.
are.
This is kind of, yeah, and this is going to be you know, a denial of service kind of concept. And whether everybody involved with it knows that or thinks that, that's how this will be used under a guise of saving people and helping people as always, and it will be abused. But so from my perspective on the the way they're being marketed, I think as you both just already highlighted, I think it's really fascinating that they're both driving from the same, they want the same objective, but as you pointed out, social inclusion, hate speech, or pandemic preparedness, right? The overlap of the being, what's it, the vaccine passport kind of conversation, right? Being illegal immigration, voting. But then I noticed an interesting point right now where they intersect, as we talked about it briefly beforehand, around anti-Semitism, right? Where both of them in different conversations are arguing that thing that needs to be suppressed. Trump is running on that like the first thing he's going to do in office, and that they both are using that technological aspect to shut it down. I found that really fascinating. But I wanted to point out something interesting over the overlap of the digital ID point. Well, first, I thought this was fascinating. Maybe you guys, if you had any comments, so right now, clearly it's being marketed as we pointed out, the SAVE Act and the idea of real ID compliant identification, which essentially is just intertwined with ID 2020. They're both digital ID concepts. That Republicans are challenging the digital ID proposal from North Carolina. So you can at least see that there's, mixed messages, because obviously a lot of Republicans were the most pushing back around the COVID-19 timeframe. And now my point of this, it's hopeful in a way that they're not falling for it in some cases, to see that might be, because the voting part is what is clearly their biggest push, in my opinion, for Republicans. And that's what I talked about in this article, that it's clearly something, a Trojan horse for digital ID, right? I mean, it's a kind of a manipulation that I think a lot of them are falling for. And I wanted to point out that the mobile driver's license point is how I see this kind of coming together. That on the Republic or the Democrat Biden administration side, they're driving forward with the mobile driver's license. And as you pointed out, they're making it sound like just a digital version of this one thing. But if you read into it, it's clear that they're saying this will become your one-stop shop for your just identification. And my point was that if you can include that with the SAVE Act, which does have other options that require, birth certificate and so on. Once this becomes something that's required, then they say in here, your physical things will no longer be valid. So those two things together, as we always point out with the two-party illusion, distill this down into the point where you're only allowed to use real ID compliant identification. I hope Republicans hear that, because this is how it's being driven in to manipulate us at the end of the day. And I also wanted to play that clip really quickly that you mentioned, Whitney, of Trump saying explicitly, not just that we'll have a biometric wall discussion, but as he points out, from air and land and sea. And I don't think illegal immigrants are coming in, flying in on jumbo jets, right? Clearly this is about us coming back and forth through the border. And I thought that was important to play.
Great. We will finally complete the biometric entry-exit visa tracking system, which we need desperately. For years, Congress has required biometric entry-exit visa tracking systems, but it has never been completed. The politicians are all talk, no action, never happens, never happens. Hillary Clinton, all talk. Unfortunately, when there is action, it's always the wrong decision. Do you ever notice?
How easy it is to fool them.
In my administration, we will ensure that this system is in place. And I will tell you, it will be on land, it will be on sea, it will be in air. We will have a proper tracking system.
Yeah. I think that's important for people to hear, because clearly Kamala's saying the same thing. So they overlap in the same conversation. But I just thought that was important to show that this is something that is going to be all encompassing. And I just don't know why anybody falls for that right now, especially Republicans.
It's strange, isn't it, that people can look at something like that and think that, yes, a proper tracking system, a digital biometric surveillance system to stop them, to stop this other person, to stop someone else, and never once does it occur to them, well, hang on a minute, couldn't that also be used to control me?
Yeah.
People just don't seem to want, or whether they want to go there, they can't go there. But obviously, if you've got a tracking, we're in the UK at the moment, we've got we've just had some problems with some civil unrest. The government has responded to that by saying that the solution to that, and I think this is another key thing that's important, the push for digital ID is so immense, and it is so all prevailing, that every situation that can possibly be exploited to introduce digital ID and biometric surveillance more rapidly, or more of it, is never missed. So the solution to civil unrest in the UK is to introduce more surveillance, biometric camera surveillance to stop the thugs traveling around the country. So they all need to be surveilled. So we need to surveil absolutely everybody. And the UN is fully on board with this. It's issued directives or issued advice to the UK government about how they can use biometric data to police protests. So they, you know, the government announced that in the wake of the, you know, the new Labour government in the UK announced that in the wake of the civil unrest, and everybody cheers. They think that's a great thing, because that will stop the violent far right thugs from moving around the country. Of course, it will also stop everyone else from moving around the country as well. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's what blows me away is that it's as simple as saying, you know, Clinton couldn't even do it, and everyone's like, well, then we should, you know, like this. It's easy, you know, and I really see that as being, as I'm recently more so pointing out. I think most conservatives and liberals are at least uncomfortable with how obvious this all is, but probably still end up voting. But my point, I think that the team sport politics side of this are what are really driving that, and they fall for these things. You know, it's just like they're that, or, you know, it's the lesser of evils. It's all kind of the same dynamic. And so we just drive right into that same control structure. So, I mean, unless you guys have any more points on that specific dynamic, I wanted to point out something that overlaps with the way that this is another angle that this is being used, and through Twitter explicitly. Now, you guys remember the conversation of Authentics, right? Which is an Israeli Unit A200 intelligence, apparatus that right now, Twitter is still actually using Authentics, despite the fact that he publicly said they would stop and they would use Stripe instead. It is still being used to take biometric data from people who are proving their identity on Twitter. And so it's another dynamic to this, is where X is openly saying that this is going to be that we're going to get rid of the anonymous aspects. We're going to be verifying your identity. And they're using a digital biometric kind of concept right this moment. And I just think that's a really interesting gap. And I wanted to point out, even Authentics on Twitter, they made this whole post back in July saying, are digital IDs the ultimate game changer for global identification? Join the discussion, digital IDs. And this is what Twitter is currently using to basically scoop your biometric data, whether or not you need it for Twitter. They say that very clear. Didn't know if you guys have any thoughts on that. I just think it's interesting how clear that is. And it's right in front of everybody, and we don't acknowledge it.
Yeah, well, I certainly have some thoughts on it. So Elon Musk, when he acquired Twitter, was quite overt about his plans to turn the social network into an American equivalent of WeChat, or something like Ukraine's Dia app, the quote unquote everything app model, with the explicit goal of authenticating all real humans. So having all people prove that they are human, presumably through linking your Twitter account to a government issued ID, and also in turning Twitter, now X, into half of the financial system, which again speaks to the broader effort to have digital ID be linked to some sort of digital wallet, which is openly referred to in UN policy documents and policy documents of governments really all over the world. And then, of course, in central bank policy documents, among other things. So I think it's quite clear that it's meant to advance that. And so a lot of these so-called techno-libertarians or self-defined libertarians or right-leaning Silicon Valley oligarchs like Musk and a lot of other people in the orbit of the so-called PayPal mafia are really full bore, very much on board with this particular agenda. A really good example of that, aside from Elon Musk himself, would be one of Peter Thiel's most prominent proteges, Peter Thiel being the other co-founder of PayPal with Elon Musk. And of course, that protege I'm referring to is Sam Altman of OpenAI fame. But Sam Altman is also behind something called WorldCoin, which has sort of established itself as a way to not only identify yourself online and provide digital ID for all sorts of online services, but also as a way to have a unique digital identifier to facilitate your receipt of universal basic income or something of that equivalent. It was, created with that explicit purpose. And because of the optics, Altman has tried to walk back the UBI aspect. But if you go and poke around what's actually going on at WorldCoin, it's still very much part of the plan. So, the goal ultimately, I think, because it's so important to this broader agenda and this broader system, and specifically financial system that they're looking to impose, that financial system in which they've invested so much money cannot function without the digital ID component. And there's a lot of other components, of course, as we mentioned earlier, that also rely on digital ID. For example, the agenda to have you link your digital ID to all of your online activity, not just what you post online or publish online, but also what you read online, the websites you visit, etc. Really, all of your online activity. And this is something that the U.S., the U.K., and Israeli intelligence have openly signed up to through this group at the World Economic Forum. The idea of having a digital ID be a requisite for online access, for internet access, period, as a way to ostensibly stop cybercrime. So have the right intensity of a cyber criminal event take place worldwide that
Right.
scares people enough, be very easy to onboard people in that sense. And in the same way, too, if digital ID is a requisite for this new digital finance system that we're being herded into, the right financial crisis similarly could onboard people onto the digital ID platform rapidly, because it will be the only way to obtain either internet access in the first example, which is essential for a lot of economic activity, or in the second example will be essential to any economic activity, period. Or maybe, if there's a banking crisis, the only way for you to obtain your money in the bank, for example. So let's say there's a major economic crisis or banking crisis in the US, and the only way you can obtain your the money that you deposited in your bank account is by, instead of having it the way it was before, receiving an equivalent amount of money in the form of tokenized deposits from your bank, for example.
Right.
There's a lot of different ways it could play out, but it's just an example. And obviously people are going to be like, yes, I want my money back, as opposed to, no, I prefer to lose all of my money to avoid digital ID, right?
Right.
So I think we should be cognizant and aware of these types of scenarios and how they're likely to be used to try and make that final push to global widespread adoption of digital ID, and also look at the extreme efforts to market it to different political groups by using all of these different rather creative strategies and sort of painting it as a way to solve all of these problems. I think that really speaks to the fact of how important it is and how badly they need people to voluntarily, at least at first, adopt them. And so this is why I really think it's very important for anyone that opposes the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, and really need to coalesce around the idea of stopping at digital ID. If enough people don't adopt or use digital ID and are excluded from that system, perhaps they could all come together in some sort of parallel system, or it could prevent the digital ID system, or the system for which digital ID is the foundation for progressing as far and as quickly as they would like. I think it's something that a lot of people that are against this type of technocratic vision could be against, and I think the efforts, particularly in the U.S., particularly targeting the Republican base, which during COVID was the most against and aware of digital IDs, to get them now to sort of acquiesce to that particular policy, or that to acquiesce to digital ID as the only way to solve crises X, Y, and Z. I think that's very telling. And also the idea of selling it initially as voluntary shows they need people to comply with it, and that they're afraid of people not adopting it and not complying. And I really would like to see a lot more consensus around that. But unfortunately, on a lot of these establishment or legacy social media platforms, the discussion is not about that. It's about further dividing and conquering people, particularly the quote unquote resistance to this technocratic system that they're trying to impose. And there's very little discussion about the different policies we can rally around and effectively stop as a group. Right. And I think it's very important for people to think about those points specifically, because it is something we can affect real change on and have an impact on. And there's a lot of efforts by a lot of so-called alt media influencers that became prominent during COVID, for example, to forget about all the things that happened during COVID because we have to vote for this person, because if we don't, literal doom, whatever. The world will end, will become whatever. There's a lot of talking points out there justifying why we should forget. But let's keep in mind vaccine passports, vaccine mandates. That was a openly stated, really, a trial for digital ID. And a lot of the same players that did the vaccine passports, like the Commons Project, for example, intimately involved in the digital ID effort. And they clearly, from their own documents, saw the vaccine passport situation as a way to trial public adoption of digital ID. So the people that were against that during COVID should still be against that now. But now there's this, there's been prominent voices that were quote unquote dissidents during the COVID era now saying we need to forget everything that happened during COVID and sort of brush that away in order to adopt, these support my particular favored politician who wasn't against those things at the time when he was in office, for example. So I don't know. I think if we can generate as much consensus as possible on the foundational nature of digital ID to this whole scheme and how we must resist it and how we should resist it, encourage people to develop plans about how to resist it in their own lives, I think is a really important and powerful thing we can do.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I wanted if you wanted to touch on, since you brought it up, Whitney, you made some great points about the possibility of Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan, and the idea of the same kind of Palantir thing you highlight where, it gets put forward to CBDCs. Trump says, no, we're against that. And then public-private partnership style create a private version of it. Would you touch on that? Because I think that's really important, and it does seem to be developing.
Yeah, if my unfortunate cough will control itself, I will happily tell you. So essentially, there's been a lot of talk about CBDCs for a long time, and you've had people come out against them, which have, of course, helped ensure their popularity, Trump being one example. But in Trump's case, he's very pro stablecoin and he's very pro Wall Street. Right. And so Wall Street's interest, and it has been for a long time, is not really to have the CBDC system that was promoted to people as the de facto CBD system back during the COVID era. Really really the model that's been favored in most countries, at least, is a two-tier CBDC system. And this is likely what will be implemented in the US, where the CBDC layer will run on the Federal Reserve's FedNow service and will only really be a mean of interbank settlement in the means through which in that other tier Wall Street banks interact, or private banks interact with central banks, right? Which is the tier the public is not privy to. And then there will be the public facing tier between the people and the private banks, because obviously the private banks, particularly in the US, don't want to be taken out of the game and have the Federal Reserve run the whole show, because in the United States, the private banks own and control the Federal Reserve. So why would they just it doesn't really make any sense in that particular case. So the threat here is that digital ID, as we mentioned earlier, is going to be linked to a digital wallet. So the concern for a long time was that the digital wallet would only really be linked to a CBDC, but that is not so. The threat here, and the threat of CBDCs, right? Because it's not the threat of CBDCs, as most critics have laid it out, is not the fact that it's issued by a central bank, because most of the money we use today is issued by a central bank. The concern is about the programmability aspect and the surveillance aspect. And so that would absolutely be true for CBDCs, but it's also true for stable coins and tokenized deposits and these other forms of, I guess, retail-facing digital money that they hope to have people use in these digital wallets. And so by having a mix of tokenized deposits, stable coins, and CBDCs, it gives the appearance, again, like the selling point is for digital ID, of a decentralized system. But really on the second layer, you're going to have the interoperable CBDCs, operating under the guise of the BIS, and all of the data from these stable coins, these tokenized deposits, which are managed by the banks that hold them, right? And then the CBDC, it's all going to be just like digital ID, collated into a central database. And the World Bank, that's building a lot of the infrastructure for this, has also developed climate wallets. Isn't that nice? So that you can also link your digital wallet to your future carbon trading and carbon offset activities. Aren't we so lucky? So obviously there's a lot of plans for this financial system, and it's important to point out, as it relates to the Americas, it is really the right wing leading with the carbon market play. You have Nayib Bukele's party in El Salvador being very involved in it, and you have Trump, the co-chair of Trump's transition team, Howard Lutnick, a major custodian also for the stablecoin Tether, being very involved with it as well. And probably the most involved will be Trump's former Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin in particular. So there's a lot of interesting things, I guess you could say, to come with this financial system that is emerging. But data harvesting, surveillability, and programmability are essential aspects of it. And the programmability aspect is where the whole exclusionary part is going to be implemented. So the
Right.
idea of you haven't done X, Y, and Z, so you cannot spend your money on this, or your bank account is locked, or you're too far from your home and there's been a government issued lockdown for this reason, so your money doesn't work 5 kilometers from your home or something like that. All of that is implemented through the form of programmability. And it's important to point out that all of this digital currency and really the digital ID system itself is meant to function on the blockchain. And the UN has been a very big proponent of blockchain for a long time. Maybe there were certain cryptocurrencies they claimed to not like a few years ago, but there's been efforts to find a place for those pesky, potentially financially empowering for the masses cryptocurrencies, have them find their place in the elites' technocratic designs. You know, they have found ways to try and make all this stuff work for them or manipulate them to their ends. So I think people need to be aware of that as well, and that the ultimate risk here is the programmable, surveillable money being the only type of money you're allowed to use. And as it relates to Trump, it's important to point out why he may be against publicly CBDCs. He is not publicly against stable coins or any of these other forms of programmable, surveillable money. And if you want someone to really be an advocate for financial freedom, I would argue they should be against programmable, surveillable money, period, frankly.
Yes.
And I think there will be an effort too to frame some of these as unconnected to governments and unconnected to big banks, with stable coins in particular. But if you look at the biggest stable coin in the world, which is Tether, they have a very deep relationship with the US government. The FBI and Secret Service are on their platforms. They freeze funds of people whenever the US or Israeli governments ask them to. So it's really not that much better than, you know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, cash is being framed as dangerous and inconvenient and all of these other things, but it does afford anonymity. And the idea that these are somehow an improvement over that, I don't really see as being accurate at all, because the goal, again, is to turn all of digital IDs the ultimate data harvesting tool. And we're moving to an era where resource extraction is not as focused on the natural world as it used to be. It's focused on extracting data from us. So in that paradigm, our online activity, including our use of social media, I mean, social media is really just being turned into a giant data harvesting farm, and we are the cattle. You know, we are what's being harvested for data. So whether it's the digital ID system, the digital finance system, or any of these other systems that are hinged on digital ID, it's a way to mass harvest data on us as much as possible, with the purpose of using that data, running it through AI or whatever, to find the most effective ways to manage us on behalf of the few that are controlling the system.
Absolutely. As James Corbett put it, oil is, or data is the new oil. Let me play that clip from BIS making that statement. We might have one more person joining, and I'm going to touch base with that really quickly, and I'll play this clip to back up what Whitney was just saying.
Analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash, and there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also we will have the technology to enforce that. Those two issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference with respect to what cash is.
Yeah. Just right on the surface, right? I mean, just saying explicitly what we're talking about, we can control how it's used. And if you don't, I mean, it's just like you're outlining, Whitney. The point being is that they can decide that you no longer meet the requirements to engage with society. And we know how that's abused. And I think that's incredible. So I wanted to
Well, it's
point out.
already
Yeah.
being abused by governments that have implemented this. Like in Nigeria,
Right.
critics of the regime are having their e-naira, their CBDC, like turned off. And there's examples of Uganda, the same thing happening, and really several other governments around the world. So, I mean, what do you expect governments to do with that kind of power? And it's important to keep in mind in a lot of these places we're talking about, the banking system has an outsized influence, or the financial people have an outsized influence on government policy, or they work together, whatever. So, I mean, they're going to work together to affect that same, control system at the end of the day, I think.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we have Catherine Austin Fitz joining. No video, unfortunately. But Catherine, you there? Do you want to chime in?
Hey, I didn't. Sorry, my apologies. I didn't realize you guys were doing it this time.
Oh,
So,
no worries. No worries.
downstairs in the kitchen in my pajamas.
It's okay. Happy to have you.
So I wanted to ask, so I agree with everything Whitney just said. I wanted to ask, we just saw a silent consensus vote at the UN, I'm told, and I haven't read the material, approving a global digital ID. And in the meantime, we're battling the real ID in the DMV in Tennessee. And I'm curious, we just had a discussion on how the real ID could dovetail and fit into the digital global ID system. And I'm curious if anybody here knows anything about that.
Well, from what Derek reported from being there, it's the global digital infrastructure was what they just voted on. And so that has been approved and that's rolling forward. And I'm with you entirely. I think it relates to everything that they're outlining and the details make that very clear. So the point I would argue is that this is the global element. And Derek's clearly trying to make sure people understand is that this is not something that's legally binding at the moment. Like your governments have, it's the global aspect of it. So we should be pushing back, but it does seem to be exactly that, unfortunately.
Well, here's the question.
Yeah, well, the UN, oh, sorry.
Yeah, you go, Whitney.
Well, I was just going to say really quick that as far as the UN is concerned, digital public infrastructure includes digital ID, which it defines as a digital public good in all digital public goods, which essentially includes all emerging technologies and technologies that are of economic importance are to be governed by the UN. So presumably the Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future and all of that were meant to advance that.
So, but what I'm assuming is a technical matter. If the U.S. Is able to create a real ID system and require the citizens to get on it or try and get them to all adopt it, that can snap into the global system very quickly, since it's, you're just talking about digital databases. So we're having a problem in Tennessee, and I think I've described it to you, Ryan, where when you get a driver's license renewal, they're telling you have to get a real ID when it's not true. And you can say, no, I refuse it. And what's been reported to me by fellow citizens in Tennessee is when they are given their new driver's license combined with a real ID, it has a yellow star on it, oddly enough. So there seems to be, and there's a lot
interesting choice.
Right,
exactly. And there's a lot of push to persuade people that after a certain point in 2025, they can't travel sort of on flights or in transportation system without a real ID, which as far as I know is not true. So especially if you have a passport or other kinds of IDs. So there seems the pressure to create the digital ID is clearly on, because you cannot do the financial control without the digital ID system. And so that is the condition precedent. And that is why it is so important. And I'd love to have a discussion. How do people stop the digital ID system from being promoted and adopted? How do they reject it? How do we stop this?
Well, let's make that the final point.
Sort of, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go, no, either one of you, go ahead.
Well, I think we sort of...
You go, Whitney.
No, it's fine. Please.
Go ahead, Iain.
So, for example, I mean, we've got the situation I was just talking about earlier that now most people in Britain, they go on holiday to the Schengen area, normally once a year or something like that. People they travel a lot. So that's a big part of the European economy. Now, the EU has set these digital requirements. I'll rephrase that. the EU, in partnership with the British government, has agreed this digital biometric. It's going to be facial recognition and fingerprints that are required in order for you to travel into the Schengen zone. Now, if people are opposed to that, and I certainly am, and the British people don't travel into the Schengen zone and decide that they're not going to spend their money in France, they're not going to spend their money in Italy, they're not going to spend their money in Spain, then that will have an impact on the economies of those. And that will be that'll have for a lot of places in Spain, certainly, and certainly in France, they're very reliant upon tourism as a source of income. That's really what I think those are the kind of choices that we will have to make if we are serious about resisting this kind of thing. And sure, what that means is, you're not going to be able to go on holiday like you used to. And maybe for many years, you might not be able to go on holiday like you used to. But if enough of us do it, they'll have to rethink it, because they can't afford to have that kind of economic disruption to, loads of their own towns and cities. So those are the kinds of things we'll have to do. It won't be easy. It will be less convenient. It will be inconvenient, and it will be a pain. But I mean, whether we want it to happen or not, the system at the moment is absolutely hell bent upon rolling out digital ID.
Well, in EU, they have to call it by different names. So in the EU, they're saying that they're prototyping vaccine passports. So here we're using the driver's licenses. They're it's like Heinz's 57 varieties. They want to keep us from seeing it. But the one thing I do want to say, and it's one of the reasons I'm so grateful, Whitney, for your pointing this out constantly, and I keep reposting some of your clips, and that is the conservatives are absolutely being sold a whole bunch of, just complete lies about, biometric, digital ID kind of systems will solve the immigration problem. And so there's a whole new marketing line of pitching conservatives on digital IDs that is absolutely offensive, and they're falling for it. Yeah. And so
yes, they are.
I really want to see is us get enough conservatives to see this, to understand how they're absolutely. I keep telling them, look, we had elections and tight borders before we had digital systems, period. So this is a bunch of, this is just yaya. Anyway, so back to you.
Well, what I would say what I would say to that is that I think, first of all, the immigration crises have been happening around the world, and they've been happening on purpose. So to manufacture consent for this type of system. So it's not just the US, it's also Europe, of course, but also South America. And so where I live in Chile, which is one of the more conservative South American countries, there's also a big effort to market digital ID as a solution to the illegal immigration issue that has become now a major political issue. But it was allowed to happen by both left and right-leaning governments. And the same is true, really, whether you're talking about the UK, the US, Chile, or any other number of countries.
Well, it wasn't just
what I think is important.
They have been pouring money into financing it happening. I mean, it's
exactly. It's been made to happen.
Right. It's been made to happen. Sorry, go ahead.
And it's part of a broader attack, as is the whole SDG agenda on national sovereignty. So you have to sort of, undermining national sovereignty, the illegal immigration, the manufacturing of that, the creation of those crises has been very useful to that effect, I think. And the people that are concerned about losing it, or losing national heritage or identity or whatever, are being sold digital ID as the solution, which is very interesting. But again, I would encourage people, I think one way that we can be effective mounting a better resistance to that is going back to the COVID era and reminding people when digital ID was being rolled out here as vaccine passports, you were opposed to it. And we should, instead of focusing on all these different people as potential saviors to our predicament, we should be focusing on the policies, who is promoting them, and oppose that policy regardless of who is supporting it and telling us we need it. And because if we're focused on the policy and not the people, I think we're a lot more effective. And by focusing so much on the people, there's been a lot of division manufactured very recently in what used to be the COVID dissident movement a
Right.
few years ago, where there was widespread opposition to digital ID and to programmable surveillable money. Now there is not, right? Or it's
No.
being slowly eroded, and you're having prominent people, like I mentioned earlier, haven't named any names, but I guess one example I can give would be Robert Malone saying things like, you need to forget what happened during Operation Warp Speed, and you need to get in line and vote for Donald, even though if I'm opposed to digital ID, I don't want to vote for anyone that's supporting it, whether they're claiming it's going to solve this issue or that issue. Like we outlined earlier, the left likes to talk about digital ID as a way to stop online bullying and protect children online and to stop online hate. Right. But the right is selling it as a solution to illegal immigration and all of this stuff. But ultimately, it's the linchpin to technocratic slavery. And as I've tried to point out, the technocrats are back both parties in the U.S. And there's no more group that's more technocratic, arguably, than the PayPal mafia. And you have members of the PayPal mafia backing Kamala, like Reid Hoffman, and then you have plenty of them backing Trump as well. And at the end of the day, a lot of those Silicon Valley oligarchs, their wealth and their power comes from their power over these financial control systems and digital control systems. They're the vendors of that to the national security states, not just in the US, but in the UK and other governments around the world. Israel as well, Palantir contracts to all three of those countries I just mentioned, for example. And all of those three countries agree that you will soon need digital ID to have any sort of access to the internet at all, for example. So, regardless of what politician you're talking about, the people behind them and then the politicians themselves are basically marketing digital ID as all these different things. But as we know, it's an inherently exclusionary system. And as I mentioned earlier in the panel, when ID 2020 was being created under the auspices of the UN, one of the people developing it described digital ID as the advent of freedom as a service, so that we'll just be leasing our freedom from the government now,
So Ryan, I think what we ought to do is I think the Alliance should sponsor a theater production, and we can just do this impromptu where everybody plays the part. So Iain can be the president of the EU, and
get you a Bond wig, Iain.
Here's the skit. We're at an advertising agency, and we're trying to figure out how to persuade people to adopt the digital ID and move into the digital concentration camp, right? And we then debate and discuss all these different tricks to get people to adopt it. And I think that would really help people see how this works.
Yeah, I mean,
comedy has a way of reaching people.
Right, exactly. And with humor, you reach people and they don't even realize it, and they're laughing at something that sticks in their mind. But I mean, anything like that, I always like the live display back and forth. I think it reaches people more. But I honestly think that more people see this than we realize. I mean, I know it's always.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Well, good. 'Cause I mean, you always get pushback in the community, even from people that are in our community, because it's hard to see that sometimes. But I really do feel that way. And it has, Whitney, I want to keep an eye on your time. I know you had a hard out, but I figured we end on the point of what Catherine was talking about, right? I mean, to back to Iain was saying, what do we do to actually stop this? And I think what's important that you highlighted there is that we're discussing the same dynamic we always talk, whether you call it vote with your dollar or something bigger than that. I just had a good conversation with Larkin Rose about a similar dynamic around voting and so on, that realistically it takes a much smaller percentage of people to just simply, civil disobedience, whatever you want to call it, to just resist the change than we think to actually stop it from happening. Because like you were highlighting, Iain, whether it's the money or even just like the infrastructure, if this, let's just say 20% of the population just weren't able to go to work that day, these things have massive consequences for the system. And so I think that's the main solution to start, is we just, we literally just say we're not going to comply. And I know that's the same thing we're saying, but what
we all do is use cash and checks, especially cash, because they can only, if they go to all digital. And so if we keep rolling back the all digital and promote the analog, that helps. What we're trying to do in the United States is get get states to pass laws saying no sales tax on purchases of a certain amount, say 500, even down to 100 or less, just to do everything we can to keep cash alive. And that helps people with inflation. It helps, the poorer families and the lower income families, but it will keep cash alive. And that's one thing everybody can do. Another thing they can do is they can send these great video shorts like the one you showed, Ryan.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Go ahead,
I have to go here in a second, so I'd like to add my thoughts before I dip here. So I think, yes, everyone should make a plan for how to opt out. If you don't want to be part of the technocratic slavery system, you absolutely 100% can't not participate in digital ID, period. So if you are one of those people that doesn't want that type of system for you or your children, you have to think about how you're going to avoid it and who you're going to work with in order to successfully be able to avoid it. Because again, like we outlined, the idea is to have you be excluded from as much of society as possible as this advances. But I think, again, we need to build consensus about people being against digital ID as a policy, regardless of who is marketing it. People need to be encouraged to think about what they will do to prevent adopting it. The voluntary nature of the digital ID cell needs to be emphasized, I think, as well, because that shows that they really need people to voluntarily adopt it, meaning that we have the power to stop it if enough of us say no. And I think that's why so much effort has been put into trying to sort of soften the biggest resistors up, I guess you could say, and sort of sell them the idea that this will somehow be a better system or will solve certain issues. It really doesn't solve anything unless you're talking about the technocratic elite who have designed it anyway. And as far as I think we should also be aware, as what Catherine said, how are we going to convince people to get into digital concentration camps? Well, what are the benefits of prison? You have a roof over your head and you have free food and you have a bed and all of this stuff, right? So if the world gets crazy enough, I'm sure that will be marketed as the way to get into the digital concentration camp. Here we are, the elite of the world. We've totally broken and messed up the world and the economy, and we've stolen all of your wealth and everything you have and taken control of everything. But we'll give you all of this free stuff you need to survive if you join our systems. And so I think if we're aware that something like that, whether it happens, in the banking system or some sort of cyber outage or whatever sort of crises is used to move the adoption of digital ID, past the brink, we need to be aware that that's going to be the final marketing ploy of desperation and what we're going to do to not just prepare ourselves, but our communities to continue to resist even when that type of event comes to fruition. And I will stop there. I most definitely have to go. Lovely to talk with all of you. Very happy to have participated in this panel. And thanks very much.
Thanks, Whitney. Have a great day.
Always a pleasure, Whitney.
You
always
guys
add a lot. So thank you for being here.
All right. Bye, y'all.
I think we all have, out here in a couple minutes. So we just end with the, where we, the same kind of points, final notes from Catherine, from Iain, and let us know, what you think we should be doing, and kind of just wrap up here. Whoever wants to go next.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to the very start where we saw that short from Catherine, where she was talking about the pillars of the whole system, bringing everything together. There is a plan for a global digital ID database. What it will be called, nobody knows yet. But certainly the World Bank have got one. It's called ID4D. That's what they're envisaging. The Bank for International Settlements have got a plan for something they're calling the Universal Ledger, which will be a ledger of all global financial transactions on the blockchain, as Whitney was talking about. This is what they have envisaged. And digital ID will be linked to our financial transactions, which, whether that's through a digital coin or whether it's through a CBDC. It's unlikely to be a retail CBDC. So the plans are afoot to bring those pillars together, just as, because obviously, it affects everything. That your digital ID can be linked to your vaccination record, which can be linked to your health record, which is so it is the linchpin that brings everything together. So really digital ID is the thing that we need to be focusing on, and it's going to be difficult to resist it because people won't, as we were discussing as well earlier, people won't necessarily know what they are buying into. It will be sold as individual vendor agnostic products, but we need to be aware that anything, as Whitney was saying, that requires digital identification, we should be automatically suspicious of that. Automatically suspicious of it. And if we have to go a bit further, maybe put ourselves out a bit and take a less convenient route to get the things that we need, then that's what we should all be doing all of the time, because that is the only way that we're going to defeat this. It's by mass. We often talk about mass non-compliance, which is, we saw that to great effect during COVID. But mass non-compliance is something that we should be doing, in my view, all the time, every day of our lives, when we are confronted with a system like the one that is being rolled out at the moment. So it's an active choice that we take every day to do things like what Catherine said: refuse not to use cash. That's something a decision that we have to take. If they won't accept cash, don't buy it. If you can't use cash, don't go there. We really do need to make these choices count. And if enough of us do it, they will count.
You're here. Catherine, do you have any, ending thoughts for us?
I agree with everything Iain just said. Absolutely. So I can't stress it enough. Use cash and checks. Everybody can do it. It's easy. And if you don't want to fight the system, it's something we can all do without, it's no one can accuse you of being ideologically fervent just because you're using cash. So that's number one. Number two, pass it on. Pass some of these. If you come to Solari, we've got shorties. Ryan just showed you that great shorty of Karsten's at the BIS, but there are plenty more. And if you go to Solari, we have a shorties collection. Send them around, because people really do, they will watch a 1-minute video and then they'll realize this is serious. Opt out, as Whitney said, be prepared to opt out and not depend on the system. But the other thing is, if you are in a good jurisdiction, so, Brian and I are in Tennessee, but if you're in a good jurisdiction, talk to your state legislators. They can absolutely, under the U.S. Constitution, the states have delegated powers to the federal government, but the powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states. And the states have the power to change this and stop this and protect the citizens so that you can at least have liquidity within your jurisdiction. So there's a tremendous number of things you can do, but we have 1 to 3 years. And if we don't do this in 1 to 3 years, we are sliding into the digital concentration camps. And my attitude, as I said, Ryan, is I think some chance is better than no chance. And I think we can stop this, but it means, we have to act now. And somebody was trying to engage with me on another political issue other than digital IDs and financial control. And I said, look, I don't have time to fix the pipes while the house is burning down.
Right.
So let's focus on, this is the meta control. I know many wonderful people who are working at the State House on health freedom or food freedom. And the reality is, if they get financial control, all of that's going to get thrown out. They'll have control of everything.
Right.
So this is the meta control. And while we work on health or food or other kinds of freedoms, we have to preserve our financial freedom.
100%. And I would simply end with the point that I know we can stop this. I mean, it's just a simple question of whether we choose to stand up and to disobey in enough numbers to make this stop. And I would also point out, and this is just the way it works, it likely wouldn't stop forever. There's always going to be another initiation, another effort to try to roll these things back out. But all the different important insights that we got today from Iain, from Whitney, from Catherine, and the idea simply being that we need to start, as we just recently discussed, Catherine, and start taking responsibility for our individual choices in these moments and stop thinking that simply voting for one person, even if you do believe them, if they are what you think they are, that one thing will change change everything. We need to take the responsibility for these actions. And I would simply end on that point of whether we're talking about the cash concept or even going back to, volunteerism, a person-to-person kind of dynamic or economy, like where we're using sound money or different exchange, like the barter system. Like these things are very valid and do exist within communities, person to person, and in regard to larger aspects, using cash and so on. So I think that right now the options are there for us. It's about recognizing the ploys and how they're trying to trick us into this. And again, on a positive note, my personal opinion, I think people see this. So what I'm asking is the individuals out there who see it but still feel pulled to gravitate towards the certain sides, call the people out in those sides. If you still think they're honest, call them out to say, look, why don't you see this? Why are we siding with this? And stand by your principles. I think that's paramount today.
Right. And you know something? Pray. Because prayer
Yes.
works. Pray.
I absolutely agree with that.
Pray
So
for
thank you. Oh, go ahead. No, just to end in general, thank you, Catherine, for being here. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. We had another great panel from the Independent Media Alliance. We've got plenty more coming your way. So stay tuned. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.